Since we're on the topic of Afghanistan, in a way, it's kind of a natural segue because WikiLeaks, of course, revealed quite a number of things about the U.S. role in Afghanistan. And the former publisher of WikiLeaks, Julian Assange, still in the midst of this extradition trial. And we are very happy to be joined here as we continue the show by the managing editor of shadowproof.com, also the co-host of the Unauthorized Disclosure podcast, along with Rania Khalek, believe it or not, Kevin Gosztola, who was in a hearing that took place yesterday about Julian Assange. Kevin, thank you so much for coming back with us.
Yeah, thanks. Good segue.
Yeah, well, I do the best I can here. So I think, I was actually unaware of this trial even happen, or this particular hearing even happening, until I saw your tweet that you were covering it. So maybe just give people a sense, Kevin. I think some people probably know Assange is facing extradition, but where this particular hearing fits in the broader legal process as it regards Assange's extradition.
We're very deep into punishment by process. And I imagine you've done some coverage of Steve Donziger's case. We've got a way of seeing 2 years of putting a human rights attorney on house arrest in order for a multinational corporation to get away with poisoning the people of Ecuador. And, Julian Assange sought asylum in the Ecuador embassy, and he's been in Belmarsh now for more than 2 years, and he is being kept in this state of limbo, in my view, because the Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA, won't let him go, won't want him to be brought to the United States and put on trial. And so this hearing that we had was about the U.S. essentially griping to judges on this appeals court in the United Kingdom that it was wrong for them to say they wouldn't let them challenge two grounds of the district court decision, two aspects of the district court's decision. Already, there's going to be an appeal hearing. We knew there would be an appeal hearing on 3 areas that were granted by the High Court of Justice. But they said, no, we want these other 2. We want to be able to try and disqualify a experienced neuropsychiatrist who treated Julian Assange. We also want to say that we don't think the evidence was considered appropriately that he's at risk of suicide. And so, I can get into more detail, however much you would like, but that's the essence of what happened yesterday, is that they persuaded the High Court of Justice on August 11th that they should have all the grounds available to them to argue that the extradition decision should be overturned. I mean, mind you, right now, doesn't feel like winning, but Julian Assange is on the winning side. He was able to prevail. The judge in January said that it would be oppressive for health reasons to extradite him to the United States because of what would happen to him in our cruel and inhumane mass incarceration system. And so now the U.S. is trying to grab at any straws they can to salvage this extradition case.
I'm so glad you brought up the issue of the discrediting of the neuropsychologist. I mean, it really it's almost unbelievable. I mean, they're essentially saying he misled the judge when it appears he did not mislead the judge. So if you could explain that a little bit more, I think that's an important piece, because it really did feel like a sleight of hand kind of argument that they were able to get back in there.
It really comes down to, how do you define misleading? I mean, and you really have to look at intent, but as is typical of an Espionage Act case, we're writing out intent, and they're just saying, oh, it happened, so it must be something crime. That's a crime, and let's punish it. So Michael Kopelman is the professor who did this treatment of Julian Assange, looked at him closely from May 2019 to December 2019. And, what they want to say is, because he didn't, in his first report, disclose that Julian Assange had a relationship with Stella Morris and had fathered 2 children in the Ecuador embassy, that he was misleading the court. And so then, in effect, all the work that he did medically should be thrown out, that they can't use it to defend Julian Assange. It's ludicrous, because first, even if we agree, let's just be harsh. Let's be really harsh towards this doctor and say he made a mistake and he should have told the court that he wanted to keep this information private, and that's what he should have done. This has no impact at all on his assessment of Julian Assange's mental state. And in fact, the judge, in doing her decision, looked at the evidence and said that she already knew he had children. She already knew he had a partner, and it didn't change her view that what Kopelman said, okay, this is what they're trying to get tossed out. This is what they don't want the High Court of Justice to acknowledge, which is that Julian Assange, if he wanted to commit suicide, wouldn't do so because he chose to do it, as in like, oh, I don't want to go to the United States. I'm going to kill myself tomorrow, hang himself like Jeffrey Epstein or whatever, you know? Maybe that's a bad example, but like people who decide they don't want to face accountability. The Enron guy did that, the Enron CEO. People like that, Kenneth Lay. He would commit suicide because of mental health disorder, because of the impulses that he would not be able to control. That's what the doctor said. And that's important to protecting his human rights and keeping him from being brought to the United States.
You know, one other thing that really caught my eye about this issue too is the idea that, you know, Stella Morris did not have legitimate reasoning for, you know, also wanting things to be disclosed and why a doctor would consider this seriously. One thing I learned from your account of the trial, I did not know that UC Global, there have been guns found allegedly with the serial numbers filed off. I mean, and this is one of the companies that's surveilling Assange. I mean, it seems like that's an important part of this too, is this sort of broader dragnet that was around them at the time and the legitimate fears that they may have had as a family.
Yeah, this was spoken about by Stella Morris after the hearing, after they lost. And also, I reported on a conversation that took place between Assange and his lawyer at the end of the proceedings. They brought Julian Assange back. He's at Belmarsh. Belmarsh brought him back to the video link. His attorney told him, you know, I don't think this is private. You're on this feed. He shared the feed. So Julian Assange was tuning in from Belmarsh. He was on the same video feed as journalists that were watching the proceedings. They say, well, this isn't private, so we should probably talk later about what happened today. But he wanted to tell his attorney right then and there that this doesn't make sense to him. An expert witness has an obligation to protect humans from any kinds of threat. My children, he was like, my children need to be protected. Like, how can you punish somebody who's an expert witness because they were concerned about the safety of people? And he mentioned a sawed-off gun. What we know is that there were weapons that were uncovered in the search of David Morales's home. He's the UC Global director. David Morales is a guy who has ties to people in the Israeli military. He's somebody who had these weapons, both of them. The serial numbers were erased. He did not have ownership licenses for these weapons. And so we don't know why he had them. But he ran this private surveillance company that we think is contracted by a U.S. intelligence agency, potentially the CIA. And they were doing a spy operation on the Ecuador embassy. They were threatening his family, his attorneys, following Baltasar Garzón, one of his attorneys, possibly burglarized his office, Garzón's office, tried to do a DNA test of his baby's diaper to determine who the father was. David Morales talked about kidnapping and poisoning Julian Assange. And what you hear in Stella's statement after court is going through the catalog of threats that their family has received in the last decade plus. His elderly son Daniel has received threats. Julian's received threats himself. Then there are threats based on the fact that the sentence could be 175 years long, if depending on how they decide to stack up the charges and how they decide to deal with the sentencing if he was ever brought to the United States. There's threats on his life. And, so those are things that need to enter into this case. And I should say this as I conclude, that Judge Vanessa Baretzer was the one who forced the disclosure of this relationship. It was her decision to not allow it to be private. So it does kind of seem like the decision to keep it concealed for as long as possible until Stella could make a decision to come forward, rather than asking for the support of the court, was the appropriate way of handling it, because she wasn't going to be open to what they wanted to do and keep it secret.
Mm-hmm.
You know, Kevin.
Yeah, go ahead, Ronnie.
With all of those details that you just described, I'm curious of the media coverage. I haven't had a chance. I followed what you were covering today with these developments, and I think I saw maybe a couple other people. But you know, you typically, especially the last time around when this case was going, even before the appeal, the media didn't pay so much attention to it, or as much as it should have. Did you feel like it got the attention that it deserved from the press?
It's a difficult question, because I spent all 24 hours yesterday focused on pushing out my work. I haven't had a lot of time to document and see what was put out, but there were 24 or so journalists that were on the video feed with me. So whether they're the ones at the establishment media organizations that we would like to see utilizing their reach, I think it's an open question. The Guardian did do their own coverage, and their work tends to get pretty good play. And there was, the Associated Press. I don't know that there was a New York Times reporter. There probably wasn't a CNN reporter. The typical culprits who are ignoring this case are probably implicated once again. But there are many, many independent journalists like myself that are committed to getting this out. There were at least a half dozen people who were doing live tweeting of the proceedings, including Consortium News, which has done some good coverage. And so I'd say that there is independent media solidarity for Julian Assange, and that's probably what counts more than how much the establishment media is failing. I really don't see them stepping up to support Julian Assange at this point. It was good, though. I will say this. It was good that at this stage, the appeals court finally allowed Reporters Without Borders to have access to the courtroom and Amnesty International to have access to the courtroom. The district court had blocked them from being able to cover and observe the hearing. And so it's good that they're going to be able to see what the U.S. government is going to try to do. And I mean this. If I have one final word on what to say with this Assange case, I want people to note that the Biden administration will not speak about this case out in the open. Anthony Blinken was asked about it by a French journalist, and he would not comment on what the U.S. government is doing. They do not feel they can defend this to people in the world. It's empowering dictators and authoritarians who are brushing off questions about press freedom in their own countries by saying, "You jailed Julian Assange. Now shut up and leave me alone." And it's letting people off the hook who are brutal to their own civilian population, because WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange continues to be held in Belmarsh prison. And so this case should die. It should not be saved. The charges should be dropped. And that's what should happen next.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And you have a little bit more than one word. I wanted to ask you one more question, too, before we let you go. The issue of the suicides and the potential suicides in prison, I mean, that seems like an extraordinary whitewash by the U.S. government in their attempt to make an appeal by, saying that the judge should have sought assurances or whatever. But I mean, anyone who knows anything about this is a true epidemic in American prisons in general. And obviously, even worse if someone has mental health challenges. So I was hoping you could talk a little bit about that element as well, because I think that that's an important aspect of how the U.S. is representing its position.
So the one small detail is really comes down to math and how they were manipulating numbers during the extradition hearing. They had a doctor say that the rate of suicide is actually higher in Britain, but Britain incarcerates way less people than the United States. Even if we're going proportionally, it'd be far less of a percentage of their population. There are so many more people. So the fact that you might have less of a percentage of the prison population that commits suicide, it still means you're going to have a huge number of people that are committing suicide in prisons every single year. And so that was actually raised during the appeal hearing. Just a note to to correct and say that like this is still an issue. It doesn't mean that there shouldn't be a concern about what could happen to Julian Assange in a jail or in a prison. And in fact, this is an abstract. There was somebody at Alexandria Detention Center who just a month and a half ago committed suicide in the Alexandria Detention Center, and did so. They were accused of armed robbery or something. It was a serious crime, but basically had a mental health disorder and needed to get treatment. And the prison refused to accept that person for treatment, and they ended up committing suicide and it's the fault of the Bureau of Prisons. Wow. And this is who Julian Assange would ultimately be in the custody of, and we cannot trust them with the well-being of this journalist. Not to mention that he just shouldn't even be in this position in the first place.